Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Tehrani in New York City. As we're listening to the leaders of NATO at the summit speak, we're going to open up our news broadcast regarding that same story, where it's an action-packed day. Day 2 of the NATO summit. Ukraine continues to dominate discussions among world leaders at the meeting, as it dominated, as we saw just a few minutes ago as well, where world leaders were speaking. This is being held at Lithuania's capital city of Vilnius. The alliance has not extended an invitation for Ukraine to join NATO as of yet. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke at a joint press conference with NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg. The latter announced a package which will bring Ukraine closer to the alliance. The NATO chief indicated that the roadmap to Ukraine's membership has become quicker and easier. This is what he had to say.
Ukraine is now closer to NATO than ever before. Allies reaffirmed that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance and agreed to remove the requirement for a membership action plan.
Stoltenberg said that the 31-nation bloc has agreed to a NATO-Ukraine Council to tighten cooperation. And according to reports, the new forum is established as one of several commitments that will be signed by Kyiv's allies.
Welcome to this first meeting of the NATO-Ukraine Council. This is truly a historic moment, allies and Ukraine sitting side by side as equals to address our common vision of Euro-Atlantic security. And I'm really honored to welcome in our midst our dear friend Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine. Welcome to you, Volodymyr. It's great to have you here.
The move, which is seen as NATO's efforts to bring Ukraine as close as possible to the alliance without actually joining it. The NATO chief reiterated that at the moment, the most urgent task for Western allies is to support Ukraine's war efforts against Russia. Despite all this, and the summit communiqué saying that, quote, Ukraine's future is in NATO, it did not set a timetable for Ukraine to join the alliance. Now, according to the communiqué, NATO will be in a position to extend an invitation to Ukraine to join the alliance when, quote, allies agree and conditions are met. Interestingly, the West has maintained its as long as it takes approach. It has not shied away once from showing its support. But on paper, NATO has been divided over Ukraine's membership. Ukraine's largest Western allies are still finalizing a joint framework that will pave the way for long-term security assurances for Kyiv. The United States and Germany are wary of any move that might take the alliance closer to war with Russia. So for Ukraine, the ongoing war continues to be the big hurdle as it pushes its bid to become part of the alliance. Okay, well, for more on this, we are now being joined by Dr. Gilbert Doctorow from St. Petersburg. Doctorow is an international affairs analyst. Thank you so much for joining us on WION, and welcome back. It seems a little premature for Ukraine to ask to join NATO when it's in the middle of a war with Russia. What are your thoughts?
It's not in the middle of a war with Russia. It's close to the end of a war with Russia, a war that is losing. Today's announcements by Stoltenberg and by others at the NATO meeting in Vilnius may fool some commentators at CNN or Euronews, but they shouldn't fool your audience. The fact is that the counteroffensive that received massive support in equipment and training from NATO countries, that Ukrainian counteroffensive has failed miserably. The latest figures that we have is that 26,000 Ukrainian soldiers and officers were killed or taken out of action on the counteroffensive against Russia in the last 30 days. They have lost hundreds of tanks. They have lost most of the advanced military equipment supplied to them by NATO countries in the preceding weeks. Mr. Zelensky may have used his opportunity as a speaker in the NATO meeting to berate NATO for not taking him in. But the fact is, the precondition for any admittance to NATO was that he would have a successful counteroffensive using the vast resources he had been given to effect. He didn't. In fact, as of yesterday, the Russians have now gone on a counteroffensive, and they have in one day taken on one of the fronts 1.5 kilometers of territory that was held by Mr. Zelensky's forces. This, despite the fact that in the preceding 30 days of Ukraine's counteroffensive, they moved a few meters here and there forward. So the result is a disastrous Ukrainian counteroffensive, the start of a new offensive by the Russians, and the Ukrainian manpower reserves are depleted. The West can supply all of the equipment it wishes to Ukraine, but Ukraine no longer has the manpower to use it and to wage a successful war. In recent days, we understand that the United States is giving little signals that it is going to push Ukraine into negotiations with Russia to end the war. The signals came from Jake Sullivan speaking to reporters when he accompanied President Biden on his way to Europe for the meeting in Vilnius. It was unequivocal. For the first time in months, Russia was not spoken of in hostile terms. President Putin was not reviled and cursed. They were taking very neutral language about Russia, which is the most obvious signal that the United States is ready to negotiate. And that is the end of the whole issue. Negotiations, for as far as Russia is concerned, mean one thing. Territorial boundaries are not the important issue. Ukraine becoming neutral, it's no longer not only having no NATO alliance, but its inability to maintain any foreign troops or institutions on its territory. That will be the non-negotiable Russian demand for any peace. And with that, NATO goes out the window.
Yeah. Well, we'll see whether NATO goes out the window or not. We'll be watching very closely. But I just to follow up on what you were saying, it's very interesting to read between the lines also for the one fact that we never hear NATO or the United States talk about Ukraine's victory moving forward. They usually talk about how even providing weapons ultimately is so Ukraine would have the upper hand in negotiations with Russia. And now we hear that the United States wants to provide cluster munitions. And then there's that deal with the F-16s. We'll see where that goes. So can you talk about that? Do you think that with everything that Ukraine has, it will be in a better position to negotiate with Russia? Not to mention the fact that Ukraine says that Russia needs to pull out all of its troops from Ukraine, including Crimea.
Well, but Ukraine entered into the counterattack under massive pressure from the United States and other NATO countries to prove that their investment in Ukraine was justified. But for that reason, they proceeded prematurely in a counter-offensive, so to speak, when they had no air cover. According to all normal military doctrine, that was fated to fail. To do what they wanted to do, you had to have air cover. They didn't have it. And to say that they're going to get F-16s in early next year, there won't be Ukraine to talk about early next year if this war continues. The Russians will continue moving till they reach the Polish border unless the Ukrainians agree to be a neutral country without NATO. But let's turn to one other question that came up in your introduction to this interview, and that was Mr. Zelensky speaking with great gratitude that various NATO members are going to give bilateral security agreements to protect Ukraine. This is a substitute for NATO. Let's be clear about one thing. The United States cannot do that. The United States Congress will not approve giving security guarantees to Ukraine. And without the United States giving the security guarantee, all of the other member countries of NATO or outside of NATO in the G7 who may want to give security guarantees to Ukraine, they're worthless. It's only the American guarantee that has any validity, and the United States absolutely will not and cannot give such a guarantee.
Mr. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us and for your thorough insight on the situation. I look forward to speaking to you again very soon. And of course, we'll be watching these developments very closely.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.